Rosa Grayson had crossed 3 territories on a rattling stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag, a yellowed letter, and a name she had been carrying like a stone in her chest for 26 years. The letter was dated 1871, written in a hand so shaky it looked like the words themselves had been frightened onto the page. Her mother had pressed it into Rosa's palm 3 weeks before she died in their cramped Kansas City boarding house room, the oil lamp guttering low, the smell of coal smoke and cheap tallow heavy in the air. Her mother had told her then, in a voice stripped down to nothing but breath and exhaustion, that Rosa's father was alive. That he had gone west to the New Mexico territory when Rosa was barely 2 years old. That his name was Thomas Grayson, and that he had a ranch somewhere near a town called Cutter's Creek, and that he had written once, only once in all those years, and that the letter was the proof. Rosa had read that letter until the paper grew soft at the folds. She had memorized every word of it, even the clumsy apologies, even the places where ink had bled into the grain of the page. And when her mother was in the ground and there was nothing left to keep her in Kansas City, Rosa had sold everything she owned that was worth selling, bought a stage ticket, and pointed herself west. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of dust and heat, and the endless brown sameness of the high desert country rolling past stagecoach windows. She had stopped at every settlement that seemed large enough to have a general store and a memory. She had asked questions in the flat, careful tone she had learned was safest for a young woman traveling alone. She had been laughed at twice, ignored a dozen times, and told by a marshal in a town called San Felipe that Thomas Grayson was a name he had never heard, and that she ought to turn herself around and go back east before the territory used her up. She had not turned around. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop on the wide dirt main street of Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of October, 1882, Rosa climbed down from the box with her carpetbag and stood in the thin autumn sunlight and looked at the place. It was not much. A general store with a warped wooden awning, a saloon whose sign had faded to near illegibility, a livery stable, a small whitewashed building that served as both the telegraph office and the post, a scattering of houses behind, and beyond all of that the tremendous open sky of the territory pressing down on everything with a kind of indifferent grandeur. She straightened her hat, which was a sensible brown felt hat and not the kind of thing that drew attention, and she walked directly into the general store. The man behind the counter was heavyset, with a thick brown mustache and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent too many years reading small print in bad light. He was weighing out dried beans into a paper sack, and he did not look up when the bell above the door rang. "Be with you," he said. "Take your time," Rosa said. She set her carpetbag on the floor and looked around at the shelves of canned goods, the bolts of calico, the coils of rope hanging from wooden pegs. Everything smelled of flour dust and kerosene, and the particular dry sweetness of old wood in a dry climate. When the man finally looked up at her, his expression shifted into something between curiosity and mild wariness, which was the standard expression most people in these towns offered to strangers, especially to young women who arrived alone on a stage. "Help you, miss? I am looking for someone," Rosa said. She had learned to say it plainly, without preamble, because preamble made people suspicious. A man named Thomas Grayson. He was supposed to have a ranch somewhere near this town or near this area. He would be in his 50s by now. The man with the mustache set down his scoop and looked at her for a moment that stretched just a fraction longer than was comfortable. He folded his hands on the counter. He was not quite meeting her eyes. "Thomas Grayson," he said, the name in his mouth like something he was testing for weight. "Yes." "Where'd you come from, miss?" "Kansas City, originally. I have been on the road from there for about 6 weeks." "That is a long way to come," he said. He picked up his scoop again and went back to the beans. "I cannot say I know that name off the top of my head. You might ask around." Rosa looked at him. She had developed a sensitivity to the particular quality of a lie told by a person who was uncertain whether they were protecting something or simply being cautious, and she heard something in his voice that was not quite either of those things but was not honesty either. She filed it away. "Thank you," she said. "Is there a place in town where I can take a room?" Widow Alcott rents rooms in the house on the far end of the main street. Blue door. She is reasonable. Rosa thanked him again and picked up her carpetbag and went back out into the October afternoon. The widow Alcott was a small, brisk woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner that Rosa found immediately comforting. She had a clean room available, narrow but adequate, with a window that looked out on the street and a washstand with a pitcher that actually held water. The price was fair. Rosa paid for a week in advance because she did not know how long she would need, and because paying in advance was the sort of thing that made landladies less likely to ask difficult questions. She ate supper that evening at the widow's table with two other boarders, a surveyor from Colorado who talked about elevation calculations in a monotone that suggested he had long since ceased to notice whether his audience was interested, and a dry goods salesman who was friendly in the slightly too eager way of a man who spent most of his time alone on the road. Rosa answered their questions about herself briefly and turned them back to talking about themselves, which they were both very willing to do, and by the time supper was finished, she had learned that the territory around Cutter's Creek was mostly cattle and sheep ranching country, that water rights were the source of most of the disputes between ranchers, and that the largest cattle operation in the county was a ranch called the Donnelly Place, some 8 miles northeast of town along the creek road. She asked, as casually as she could manage, whether either of them knew a rancher named Thomas Grayson. The salesman shook his head. The surveyor paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, then set it down, then picked it up again and resumed eating without answering. Rosa watched that small sequence of movements with the focused attention she had been applying to everything since she crossed the first territory line. In the morning, she went to the post office and telegraph building and spoke with the young man who ran it, whose name was Earl and who had the kind of open, freckled face that suggested he had not yet learned to be guarded about what he knew. She asked about Thomas Grayson. Earl frowned thoughtfully, shuffled some papers that did not need shuffling, and said that the name rang a bell but he could not quite place it, and that she might want to speak to Mr. Donnelly out at the Donnelly Ranch, because Mr. Donnelly had been in the territory longer than most anybody and knew everyone who had ever ranched within 50 miles. Bernard Donnelly, Rosa said, because she had heard the name at supper the night before. "Yes, ma'am. He has been out there since before I was born. If anybody knows a Thomas Grayson, it would be him." Rosa thanked Earl and walked back out into the morning, which was cool and clean-smelling, the sky overhead a deep October blue with a few high white clouds moving fast on a wind she could not feel at ground level. She stood on the wooden sidewalk and thought about her options. She could hire a horse or a wagon and ride out to the Donnelly place that day, or she could continue asking in town and hope someone gave her more to go on before she appeared on a stranger's doorstep. She decided on directness. It had served her better than hesitation, on average. The liveryman was a laconic Mexican man named Ortega who had a good bay mare available for hire at a reasonable daily rate. He gave Rosa directions to the Donnelly Ranch with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who had given those directions many times. 8 miles northeast on the creek road. Look for the split cottonwood. Turn where the fence starts and follow it until you see the house. Rosa had learned to ride as a girl, not well, but well enough to manage a quiet mare on a known road, and the bay mare was exactly as described. Quiet, steady, with a pleasantly rolling walk that covered ground without fuss. The creek road followed the course of a shallow, green-banked creek, lined with cottonwoods, whose leaves had turned a deep amber gold in the October cold. The sky above the cottonwoods was extravagant, the kind of sky that seemed designed to make everything beneath it feel simultaneously small and vividly alive. Rosa rode through it with the letter folded inside her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs, and she tried not to build any expectations. She had been building and dismantling expectations for 6 weeks, and she was tired of it. She found the split cottonwood, which was an enormous old tree that had been struck by lightning and healed around the wound, until it stood again as 2 separate trunks growing from the same base. She turned where the fence started, a good solid post-and-rail fence in better repair than most of what she had seen in her weeks of traveling, and she followed it for perhaps a quarter mile until the house came into view. It was not what she had expected. She had expected a rougher sort of place, the kind of working ranch that spoke purely of function and nothing else. What she saw instead was a house that had clearly started as something functional and been added to over the years with evident care, so that it now had a proper porch across the front, and a second story at one end, and window boxes that had held flowers in the summer, and still held the dry brown stubs of them in October. There were outbuildings, a large barn in red-painted wood, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and several corrals where horses and cattle stood in the autumn morning light. It looked like the work of a person who had committed to a place, who had put down roots that went deep enough to be permanent. 2 dogs came out to meet her as she rode up, large mixed-breed dogs that barked briefly and then subsided into curious tail wagging when she spoke to them in a calm voice. A young ranch hand appeared from the direction of the barn and watched her approach. "Help you, ma'am. I am looking for Mr. Bernard Donnelly," Rosa said. "I was told in town that he might be able to help me find someone." The hand looked her over with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to judging strangers fast and nodded. "He is around back in the south corral. I can take you." She dismounted and handed the mare's reins to him and followed him around the side of the house. Bernard Donnelly was standing inside a corral with a young horse, a 3-year-old bay colt that was dancing sideways and flagging its tail, and doing everything in its power to communicate its displeasure at having a saddle placed on its back. The man working with the colt was not shouting at it or jerking at its head. He was moving slowly, talking in a low voice, letting the colt come around to him in its own time. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain canvas work coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. When the ranch hand called out to him, he looked up. Even from across the corral, Rosa could see that he was not an old man, which surprised her, given how long he had supposedly been in the territory. He was probably in his middle 30s, she thought, though the outdoor life had put a weathered quality on him that made exact aging difficult. He had a straight, strong face, dark brown eyes, and several days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw. He handed the colt's lead rope to another hand who had been standing by the fence and came toward her. He was wiping his hands on a piece of cloth tucked in his belt, and he was looking at her with an expression that was polite and attentive and gave nothing away. "I am Bernard Donnelly," he said. His voice was low and even with the faint remnant of an accent that sounded originally Irish, smoothed by years on the western plains. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Rosa Grayson," she said. "I have come from Kansas City. I am trying to find my father." "His name is Thomas Grayson, and I was told he ranched somewhere near Cutter's Creek. I was directed to you by the young man at the telegraph office, who said you had been here longer than most and might know him." Something moved across Bernard Donnelly's face. It was not a large movement, but Rosa had been watching faces for weeks, and she caught it the way you catch a shift in the air before a storm. His dark eyes held her gaze for a moment and then dropped to the fence post beside them, and something in his jaw tightened, and he was very still for a beat that lasted just a moment too long. He knew that name. She was absolutely certain of it. And then he went quiet. The silence sat between them for several seconds. One of the horses in the corral snorted. A crow called from the cottonwoods along the creek. The young ranch hand who had brought Rosa around stood a few feet away pretending to check a fence post. "Thomas Grayson," Bernard said, and his voice was careful in a way it had not been a moment ago. "Yes," Rosa said. She kept her voice level. "Do you know him?" Bernard looked at her. His expression had become something careful and contained, the look of a man who was deciding something. "Why don't you come up to the house," he said, "and have some coffee?" It was not an answer. It was also not a denial, and Rosa recognized the difference. She followed him up to the house without pressing him, because she had learned that pressing too fast closed people down. She had time. She had already waited 26 years. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something savory that had been simmering on the iron stove for some time. A woman in her 60s with a sun-darkened face and black hair threaded with silver was working at the stove, and she turned when they came in and looked at Rosa with frank, unhurried interest. "This is Esperanza," Bernard said. "She has kept this house since I was a boy. She will take care of you while I wash up." Esperanza poured Rosa a cup of coffee and set out bread and a small dish of preserves, and said nothing about Rosa's presence in the way that suggested it was none of her business, though she looked at her once or twice with an expression that was not unkind. Bernard came back with his face and hands clean and his hat off. Without the hat, Rosa could see his hair clearly, dark brown and thick, a little longer than was fashionable, and she revised her estimate of his age slightly, perhaps 36 or 37. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment. "You said your name is Grayson," he said. "Thomas Grayson would be your father." "Yes. Your mother is still in Kansas City." "My mother died 6 weeks ago," Rosa said, and she said it cleanly because she had practice by now. "She told me about my father before she died. I have a letter he sent her in 1871. He mentioned a ranch near Cutter's Creek. That is all I have." Bernard was quiet for another moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He was not looking at the cup. He was looking at the table between them with an expression that had a complicated interior quality, like a man reviewing something he had been carrying for a long time and deciding what to do about it now that someone had asked. "How old are you, Miss Grayson?" He said. 28, she said. "I was 2 years old when he left." Bernard set the coffee cup down. He looked at her directly. "Your father ranched about 12 miles from here," he said. "The Grayson place was on the other side of the ridge along a different branch of the creek. I knew Thomas Grayson. I knew him well." Rosa's hands had gone still around her own cup. "Knew," she said. "Past tense." "Yes." Bernard's voice was even, but there was something in it that was not indifferent. "He died in the spring of 1877. A fever. It took him fast. He was not an old man, and I do not think he was expecting it. I was 29 years old, and I had known him for about 10 years by that point, since I came out here as a young man. He was the first neighbor who rode over to introduce himself when I moved onto this land, and he was a good man. I was sorry to lose him." Rosa was very still. The kitchen was warm and the fire in the stove was steady, and somewhere outside one of the horses in the corral was calling to another, and the news that had been delivered to her in a quiet voice across a kitchen table rearranged everything she had built in her chest over the past 6 weeks. She had not let herself believe she would find him. She had not let herself hope too concretely. But the hope had been there anyway, below the practical surface of her preparations, the small stubborn flame of it, and now it had gone out. She breathed in slowly and breathed out. "Did he know about me?" she said. "Did he ever speak about a daughter?" Bernard looked at her with something careful and painful in his eyes. "He spoke about a woman he had left in Missouri. He spoke about it in a way that a man speaks about something he regrets so deeply he cannot hold it straight in his mind. He told me once, when we had been friends long enough for such things, that he had a daughter he had never gone back for. He said her name was Rosa." The word landed in the kitchen like something physical. Rosa felt it in her throat and behind her eyes, and she was not going to cry in front of this man she had known for 15 minutes. She was not. "He said her name," she said. "He did." Bernard's voice was very quiet. "He said it the way a man says a thing he has no right to say anymore but cannot stop himself from saying." Rosa set her coffee cup down very precisely in its saucer. She looked at the window above the stove, at the October light coming through it, at the dry cottonwood leaves blowing past. Did he leave anything behind? Any property? Any papers? The ranch was sold off to settle debts when he died. There was not much of it left by then. He had not been managing it well the last couple of years. I think he was already sick before anyone realized it. There was not a great deal. Bernard paused. But there was a box of papers and personal effects that he had left in my keeping, maybe 2 years before he died, when he was selling off some of the cattle and trying to raise money. He said to me, "Bernard, if anything happens to me, hold these." He knew where to find me. He trusted me with them. Rosa looked at him. "You kept them?" 5 years, Bernard said. "I have kept them 5 years, not knowing whether anyone would ever come to claim them. I looked for your mother's address after he died. The letter he had from her was too old and the address was no longer good. We moved several times," Rosa said. "Kansas City was the last. I did not know what else to do," Bernard said. "So I kept them." Rosa was looking at him with a new, very clear kind of attention, the kind that comes when you see a person step unexpectedly into a different light and they reveal dimensions you were not accounting for. This man had held a dead friend's papers for 5 years against the possibility that someone might one day come looking. "Can I see them?" she asked. He stood up immediately and said, "Of course." He brought the box from somewhere in the house, a plain wooden box about the size of a bread loaf, with a simple latch. He set it on the kitchen table in front of her and stood back, giving her room. She opened the latch and lifted the lid. There were letters in the box. There were papers that looked like deed records and survey records. There was a small tintype photograph in a cardboard mount, creased at one corner. Rosa picked up the photograph and looked at it. A man in his 30s, standing beside a fence post, looking at the camera with a slightly squinting expression that might have been trying to be serious, but was not quite managing it. He had a high forehead and a long jaw and ears that stuck out slightly. Rosa looked at the photograph for a long time. "He looks a little like you," Bernard said, from where he stood by the stove. He said it gently, and when Rosa looked up at him she saw that he meant it as a kindness, not as observation. The same way around the eyes. Rosa set the photograph down with great care. She looked back into the box. Among the papers near the bottom there was a folded letter in a woman's handwriting. Her mother's handwriting. It was one of the letters her mother had sent. Rosa recognized the hand before she had read the first word. She pressed her lips together very firmly and placed it back in the box on top of the other things, and she closed the lid. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping these." Bernard poured more coffee into her cup without asking. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "There was no question about it." They sat for a while in a kitchen that was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and Rosa asked him about Thomas Grayson, what kind of man he had been, what the ranch had looked like, how he had laughed and what had made him angry and what had made him generous, and Bernard told her. He told her in the unhurried way of a man who is not performing memory but simply opening it, and Rosa listened to every word with the concentrated attention of someone receiving something precious and irreplaceable. By the time Esperanza put plates of food in front of them, which she did without being asked, and with the decisive manner of a woman who fed people as a primary expression of care, Rosa had a father who was more than a yellowed letter and a name carried in her chest. He was a man who had laughed loudly at bad jokes, who had a temper that ran hot and burned out fast, who had been generous with his labor when neighbors needed help but careless with money, who had loved horses the way certain men love horses, with a thoroughness that crowded out other things. Rosa ate the food on her plate and thought about that. "Did he ever try to go back?" she said. Bernard was quiet for a moment, and she knew the answer before he spoke. "No. I think he told himself he would for a long time, and then I think he stopped telling himself that, because a man can only carry a certain amount of that kind of intention before it becomes something else." He paused. "I am sorry. That is not what you were hoping to hear." "It is what it is," Rosa said. "I have had time to consider the possibilities." She did not say that the worst possibility had not been finding him dead. The worst possibility had been finding him and having him not want to know her, that at least she had been spared. After lunch, Bernard offered to ride out to where the Grayson place had been, what remained of it if she wanted to see it. She said yes. They rode out in the clear October afternoon, Rosa on the bay mare and Bernard on a gray horse that was clearly his regular mount, a steady, well-mannered animal that reflected the manner of its rider. They rode along the creek and then up over a low ridge and down the other side into a valley, where a creek branch ran through tall grass that had gone winter-brown and pale. What was left of the Grayson ranch was a foundation, a stone chimney still standing, and the ghost of a fence line visible in the grass. A few old fence posts leaning at various angles, the wire long since removed or rusted away. The cottonwood trees that had probably been planted as windbreaks were large now, much larger than they would have been when Thomas Grayson first put them in. They stood in a loose row along what had been the property's northern edge, their upper branches still holding a few last golden leaves that shivered in the cold afternoon wind. Rosa dismounted and walked to the foundation. She stood on its edge and looked at the stone chimney and the grass growing between the old stones where the floor had been, and she thought about a man standing in this kitchen, this vanished kitchen, making coffee in the morning and going to bed at night, and thinking, perhaps, about a woman and a daughter in Missouri. She thought about the particular loneliness of that. Bernard stood back, holding both horses by the reins, and gave her the space to be in the moment without filling it. She was aware of that courtesy and grateful for it. When she turned back to him, he was watching her with an expression that was not pity, which she would have resented, but something more complex and more honest than that. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the reality of a painful thing without the flinching need to make it something smaller. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Of course," he said. They rode back in the late afternoon light that turned everything along the creek into something gilded and briefly perfect, and they did not talk much, and the silence was comfortable in the way that some silences between strangers are, when the strangeness between them has been replaced by something else. Some mutual understanding arrived at without negotiation. When they reached the ranch again, Bernard said she was welcome to stay for supper if she wished, and that the ride back to Cutter's Creek in the full dark was not advisable on an unfamiliar road. Rosa thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "I would appreciate that," she said. Supper was a longer, more relaxed thing than lunch had been, partly because the initial weight of the morning's news had settled into something more manageable, and partly because Bernard Donnelly was, Rosa was discovering, a man who was interesting to talk to. He had come to the territory as a young man of 19, the second son of an Irish immigrant family from Ohio, with no particular plan beyond the general Western, one of making himself a life. He had arrived in New Mexico in the spring of 1866, when the territory was still rough and newly post-war, and full of the particular restless energy of a place that had not yet decided what it was going to be. He had worked as a hand for a year, saved his wages, bought a piece of land along the creek that nobody else wanted because the water rights to it were complicated, spent 2 years sorting out those water rights through a combination of legal patience and stubborn negotiation, and had been building the ranch ever since. "You have been here 16 years, Rosa said. "Give or take," Bernard said. He was leaning back slightly in his chair with his coffee cup in one hand, and there was something in the ease of his posture that spoke of a man comfortable in his own house in the way that comes from having built it himself. "Long enough that I do not much think about anywhere else as home." "Do you have family back in Ohio?" "A mother still living and a younger sister married in Columbus. I go back every few years." He paused. "My father died in '74. I got back in time to say goodbye." "I am sorry." "He had a good life," Bernard said simply. "He came from nothing in Ireland and built something here, and his children had more than he had, and that was what he wanted." Rosa thought about that. She thought about the particular immigrant arithmetic of it, the calculation of sacrifice and progress measured in generations. Her own mother had been the daughter of German immigrants, had arrived in Missouri as a small child and never quite felt entirely at home anywhere, and had spent her life in a kind of low-grade, uncomplaining displacement that Rosa had absorbed as the normal texture of existence. She was only beginning to understand, traveling west alone at 28 with nothing but a carpetbag and a name, that displacement was not the only option, that a person could deliberately choose a place and become of it. She did not say any of this to Bernard Donnelly, because it was too much to say to someone she had known for an afternoon, but she thought it. After supper, the widow Alcott's room and the return journey to Cutter's Creek became a logistical question, and Bernard solved it simply by saying that the guest room in the house was available, and that Esperanza would be offended if it went unused. Rosa considered this offer and the state of the October night outside, which had gone very cold and very dark, and accepted. She lay in the guest room's clean, narrow bed under a good wool quilt and looked at the ceiling and thought about the day. She had come looking for a living father and found a dead one, which was a loss, but it was a loss she could grieve cleanly because there was no ambiguity in it, no possibility of rejection or disappointment or complicated reconciliation. She had found instead the ghost of a man who had said her name, and a box of papers, and a tall rancher with dark eyes who had kept those papers 5 years against the possibility of exactly this moment. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than she had dared hope for. She went to sleep with the cottonwood leaves tapping against the window in the night wind, and slept better than she had in weeks. In the morning, Esperanza made breakfast, and did not pretend to be unsurprised to see Rosa at the table, which Rosa took as a form of acceptance. Bernard came in from the early morning chores with cold on his coat and fresh air, and sat down with the directness of a man who does not see the point of easing into the day. He looked at Rosa across the table with a level, open look that she was already beginning to recognize as his natural expression when he was not guarding anything. "What will you do now?" he asked. It was a reasonable question, and she had been thinking about it since before dawn. "I am not entirely certain," she said honestly. "I came with one purpose, and that purpose has been resolved one way or another. I do not have much to go back to in Kansas City. My mother is dead. I had been working as a clerk in a dry goods establishment, but that work can be found anywhere." "Do you want to stay in the territory?" he asked. He said it carefully, as a person says something that matters more than it wants to appear to matter. Rosa looked at him. "I am considering it," she said. He nodded. He ate his eggs and did not press further. But when she left after breakfast, riding the bay mare back to Cutter's Creek with the box of her father's papers strapped to the saddle in front of her, he walked out to where Ortega's boy had brought the mare around and held the horse while she mounted. "If you decide to stay," Bernard said, looking up at her in the morning light with the directness that was becoming, she thought, one of his most consistent characteristics. "There is work on this ranch that a person who can read and keep accounts could do. I have been managing my own books for years, but it is not my strength and I am behind on it. I am not offering charity. I am offering work." Rosa sat on the mare and looked down at him, at the straight, honest face and the dark eyes that were doing their best to be neutral about what was actually a rather complicated proposal. "I will think about it," she said. She thought about it for 2 days. She spent those 2 days in Cutter's Creek, going through the box of papers her father had left, reading the letters he had kept from her mother, understanding the shape of something that had broken before she was old enough to see it, and had continued breaking slowly for 20 years after. She visited the small cemetery at the edge of town and found Thomas Grayson's grave, which had a plain headstone with his name and the years of his life, 1828 to 1877, and nothing else. She stood at it for a long time. She wrote a letter to his memory, privately, in the widow Alcott's narrow room, and then burned it in the candle flame because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be kept. Then she sat in the window and watched the main street of Cutter's Creek in the late afternoon and thought about what she wanted her life to look like. On the 3rd morning she went to the livery and hired the bay mare again and rode the 8 miles northeast to the Donnelly ranch. Bernard was in the yard when she arrived, talking with one of his hands about something to do with a section of fence that needed repair before winter. He looked up when he heard the horse, and she saw the quick calculation move through his eyes, the swift reading of the fact of her return and what it might mean. She dismounted and walked over to him. "I will take the work," she said, "if the offer still stands." "It stands," he said. She started the following Monday, riding out each morning from the widow Alcott's and working through the ranch accounts in the small office off the kitchen, a room that had been used primarily for storage and which she and Esperanza cleared out and organized in a single efficient morning. The books were, as Bernard had said, behind. Not chaotically, but in the way of a competent man who has too many other demands on his attention. Bills of sale entered in the wrong column, water fees tracked inconsistently, the cost of feed and the income from cattle sales coexisting in a ledger that could only be fully understood by Bernard himself, because it had never been designed to be understood by anyone else. Rosa was good at this. She had been good at it in the dry goods establishment in Kansas City, and she was good at it here, and she settled into it with the focused pleasure of a person doing something they are well suited to do. Within 2 weeks, she had the current year's accounts straight and had developed a system for the coming year that would make Bernard's financial picture legible to anyone who needed to see it. Bernard came into the office most mornings to answer questions and look over what she was working on, and these sessions, which began as purely practical exchanges, gradually became something more varied and interesting. He would answer a question about a specific sale, and then sit on the edge of the desk for a few minutes talking about the state of the cattle market in New Mexico, or about the water rights question that was the source of ongoing tension between two ranchers to the south, or about the early hard winters of the 1870s when he had lost a third of his cattle and had not been certain the ranch would survive it. And Rosa would respond and ask things and offer observations that were sometimes practical and sometimes not, and the conversation would grow in directions neither of them had initially planned. She noticed, about 3 weeks in, that Bernard had stopped leaving the office after these morning sessions and started staying for the better part of the morning. She noticed, a week after that she was spending the last portion of each evening thinking about the conversations they had had and anticipating the ones they would have tomorrow. She was not incautious enough to call this anything yet, but she was honest with herself about it. The other thing she was doing in those weeks was becoming familiar with the ranch and the land around it in a way that was separate from the account books. She took the mare out on Sunday afternoons along the creek road and further, learning the lay of the land and the quality of the light at different hours, and the way the territory looked in the late fall when the high sky went that particular deep winter blue and the cottonwoods stood bare and silver-barked along the water. She helped Esperanza with the kitchen preserving when she was present for it, and was given a brief, comprehensive education in the difference between good and bad chili peppers by a woman who had opinions on the subject that were not negotiable. She met the ranch hands one by one in the natural course of the workday. There were 4 of them: Calhoun, a quiet older man from Texas who had been on the ranch nearly as long as Bernard; Hayes, a younger man, recent from Kansas, who was learning and eager and slightly anxious about demonstrating his competence; 2 Rivers, a Jicarilla Apache man who managed the horses with an authority and knowledge that was visibly superior to anyone else on the ranch, and who was regarded by everyone including Bernard with the respect due to genuine expertise; and a boy of about 18 named Paco, who was Esperanza's nephew, and was learning everything simultaneously, with the slightly dazed air of someone drinking from 3 wells at once. It was through conversations with Calhoun, who was the kind of man who talked frankly once you had earned his willingness to talk at all, that Rosa learned some of what she had not been told. Calhoun had been there 20 years ago in the early territorial days, and he remembered Thomas Grayson in a way that was less sentimental than Bernard's telling, and therefore, Rosa thought, probably more accurate. A man who had good intentions and inconsistent follow-through, who was better with animals than with money, who had been drinking more in the last years of his life than was good for him, who had talked about going east and never went. A man who had real kindness in him but who had made real failures too, and who had perhaps known both those things about himself and not known how to reconcile them. Rosa took this in. She thought about justice and about forgiveness, and about the difference between forgiving a man and pretending he had not done the things he had done. She thought her mother had deserved better. She thought her father had probably deserved, if not forgiveness, then at least the honesty of being seen as a full person rather than a simple villain or a simple victim of his own limitations. She kept these thoughts mostly to herself. One afternoon in late November, after the accounts were done for the day and the light was going early the way it does in November, Bernard appeared in the office doorway and said the creek had frozen over in the night and asked if she wanted to see it. It was a small and genuine invitation, the kind that is really an admission of wanting company, and she accepted it. They walked down to the creek in the cold late afternoon, their breath visible in the air, and stood on the bank looking at the ice. It was not a hard freeze, just the shallow edges of the creek glazed over, the ice clear enough to see the dark water moving beneath it. The cottonwoods on the far bank were bare and gray against the pale winter sky, and there was no sound at all except the water and very faintly the wind. "How do you find it here?" Bernard asked. He was looking at the ice, not at her. "I find it very beautiful," Rosa said. "I do not think I entirely expected to. I expected the territory to be harsh, and that would be the whole of it." "It is harsh," he said, "but there is more to it than that." "Yes," she said. "I am beginning to understand that." They stood there for a little while longer. The silence between them had long since stopped being the silence of strangers and become something more comfortable and more complicated, the silence of people who have more to say than they are saying. Bernard turned to look at her then, in the cold pale light of the November afternoon, and Rosa met his eyes without looking away, and something that had been building in the way that honest things build, slowly and without drama, became suddenly very plain between them. "Rosa," he said. Just her name, with a quality in it that made it into something considerably more than just her name. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a man who speaks about this sort of thing easily," he said. "I know that too," she said. He turned back to the creek and looked at the ice for a moment and then turned back to her. "When you came to this ranch the first morning," he said, "I was not looking for anything to change. I had my life arranged as it was, and I was not dissatisfied with it." "And now," Rosa said. "And now," Bernard said, "the mornings when you do not come out from town seem considerably longer than they used to." It was not, by the standards of the romantic novels she had read as a girl in Kansas City, a poetic declaration. It was blunt and a little awkward and entirely sincere, and Rosa found she preferred it to poetry. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "that the widow Alcott's room, while perfectly adequate, has a view of only the main street of Cutter's Creek, and that I have grown considerably more interested in a view of this creek." Bernard looked at her. His expression had done something rare, the controlled, contained face relaxing into something warmer and more open. "Is that so?" he said. "It is," she said. He looked at the creek and then back at her, and then, with the deliberateness of a man who does not do things by half, he reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm in the cold air, and Rosa held it and felt, under the grief and the long journey and the complicated resolution of the question she had come here to answer, something she had not been expecting, an uncomplicated sense of rightness, the feeling of a thing settling into the correct position after a long displacement. They stood by the frozen creek until the light was nearly gone, and then they walked back up to the house together, and neither of them let go. December came in hard and cold, with a week of heavy snow in the middle of the month that kept everyone close to the buildings, and filled the days with the particular intimacy of people sheltering together against a hard winter. Rosa stayed at the ranch during the storm rather than attempting the creek road to Cutter's Creek, and the days of enforced proximity were, she would think later, probably where the real understanding between them was built. The daily understanding that is made of small things, of how a person reacts when the stove goes cold at 3 in the morning and the firewood box is empty, of how they talk to the hands and to Esperanza, and to the horses in the barn when the horses are frightened by the wind. She learned that Bernard woke early out of habit and preference, and spent the first hour of each day in a quiet that was neither sulky nor withdrawn, but simply private. A man taking his measure of the day before the day took its measure of him. She learned that he read, which she had not initially expected, that there was a shelf of books in the sitting room that included Dickens and some volumes of natural history, and a well-worn Bible that she thought probably came from Ireland with his mother or his father. She learned that he had strong opinions about the management of water and land that were rooted in a genuine understanding of the territory as a system, as something that could be sustained or depleted depending on how it was treated, and that these opinions put him in occasional friction with neighbors who did not share his long view. She learned that he was patient with most things and impatient with waste, that he was honest in business in a way that was not common enough, that he treated Two Rivers and Paco and Esperanza with the same basic respect he extended to anyone he worked alongside, which was not universal in that time and place, and which she noticed and thought about. He learned her too. He learned that she was precise about numbers and about words, that she disliked imprecision in either. He learned that she was braver than she looked, which was something he had suspected from the first morning she rode into his yard alone on a hired mare with nothing but a question and a dead man's name. He learned that she grieved quietly and in private, that she processed things by thinking about them rather than speaking about them, and that when she had finished processing something, she could discuss it with a directness that some men might have found disconcerting, but which he found, on the contrary, deeply reliable. He told her this once, in the quiet of an evening by the sitting-room fire, and she had looked at him with an expression that suggested she was not entirely used to being found reliable as a compliment rather than a mild criticism. "Most people say directness in a woman is difficult," she said. "Most people are wrong about a number of things," Bernard said. She laughed, which was a sound he had been cataloging, without exactly intending to, since the first time he heard it, that first day at the kitchen table when she had said something dry about the state of her father's account-keeping and laughed at her own observation. It was not a polite laugh. It was a real one, quick and warm and entirely unself-conscious. He was thoroughly in love with her by Christmas and had been for several weeks before that, and he was aware that he was at the age when a man either finds what he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting or does not find it at all. He was not sentimental about this, because he was not a sentimental man, but he was clear about it. On Christmas Eve, which they spent at the ranch because the weather had softened enough to be merely cold rather than dangerous, Esperanza cooked enough food for 3 times the number of people present, which was a quantity decision that appeared to have nothing to do with the number of people present, and everything to do with a philosophy about Christmas. There were the 4 hands, eating and laughing at the long kitchen table, Two Rivers quiet and observant as he always was in social situations but present, which was itself a kind of participation. There was Esperanza's sister who had ridden over from Cutter's Creek for the occasion, and who was a larger and louder version of Esperanza with a great deal to say about the territory, the weather, the quality of this year's chilly harvest, and several neighbors. There was Rosa, who had been to the widow Alcott's room to collect her good dress for the occasion, the one dark blue wool dress she owned that was not purely practical, which she wore now with her dark hair pinned up. And there was Bernard, who had put on a clean shirt and his good coat, and was managing the occasion with the slight air of a man who likes people well enough in managed quantities, and finds large group festivities mildly overwhelming, but is too polite to show it. After supper he and Rosa slipped away from the noise of the kitchen and went out to the porch, which was cold but bearable with coats, and stood looking at the winter stars over the territory, which in December and at that altitude were extraordinary, vast and thick, and blazing in the absolute darkness of a sky uncompromised by any artificial light for miles in any direction. "I want to ask you something," Bernard said. Rosa had her coat collar turned up and her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, and she looked sideways at him with the expression she had when she knew what was coming and was waiting to see how it was going to be said. "Then ask," she said. He turned to face her on the porch, not leaning on the railing anymore but standing square and direct, the way he did when he was being serious about something. The starlight was enough to see his face, the steady dark eyes and the expression that was both more open and more careful than his usual one. "I want to marry you," he said. "I am asking you whether you want to marry me. I am not assuming. I know that you came here for a different reason, and that your life did not begin with me in it, and does not have to include me to be a life. But I would like very much to be included in it if you are willing." Rosa looked at him standing in the cold starlight on his porch, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the weeks of dust, and the stagecoach, and the questions asked in flat voices in 100 general stores and post offices, and the box of her father's papers and the grave with the plain headstone, and all of it had led here, to this porch and this man and this enormous winter sky. And she thought that if she had been designing a destination, she could not have done better than what she had found. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and when he kissed her in the cold Christmas Eve air with the stars blazing overhead, it was neither hasty nor tentative, but exactly what it should be. The kiss of two people who have found each other after a long journey and intend to stay found. They were married in February of 1883 in the small church in Cutter's Creek, which the minister had heated for the occasion with a wood stove that roared so vigorously that the ceremony was conducted in a haze of wood smoke and dry warmth. Esperanza sat in the front pew with her sister and cried with the unashamed thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment for some time and intended to give it its due. The ranch hands were all there, Calhoun in his best hat, Hayes in a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large, 2 Rivers in the back row watching everything with calm dark eyes, Paco in the front with Esperanza and her sister looking alternately solemn and overwhelmed by the occasion. The widow Alcott came, an earl from the telegraph office, and a number of other townspeople who had come to know Rosa over the past months. The man with the mustache from the general store came too, and he shook Rosa's hand after the ceremony with a slightly sheepish expression, and said he had known the Grayson name when she had first asked him, had known Thomas Grayson in passing from trips to that side of the county, and had not said so because he had not been sure what kind of trouble might follow a young woman arriving alone asking questions. Rosa said she understood that caution and bore him no ill will, which appeared to relieve him considerably. They rode back to the ranch in the February afternoon, Rosa and Bernard, in the wagon because the road was too icy for horses, and the sky was the pale, cold blue of a winter afternoon heading toward dusk, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and silver and casting long, thin shadows on the frozen ground. "Home," Bernard said, when they turned through the gate and the house came into view. Rosa looked at the house with its porch and its window boxes and the smoke coming from the chimney where Esperanza had kept the fire banked, and she felt the words settle into her with the simple solidity of a true thing. "Yes," she said, "home." Spring came to the territory in March and then retreated and came back again in April in earnest, the way spring does in high desert country, sudden and overwhelming, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the grasses coming up green and vivid, the cottonwoods putting out their first small leaves. Rosa threw herself into the spring of the ranch with the energy of someone who had found a purpose and was not wasting time about it. The account books were in better shape than they had ever been, and she had taken on, in addition, the management of correspondence and contracts that Bernard had previously handled himself with the laborious slowness of a man who could do it but did not enjoy it. She also began to learn, seriously and systematically, the practical management of the ranch itself, the things that could not be done from a desk. She rode out with Bernard in the mornings when he was checking fences or moving cattle, not as an observer but as a working participant, learning the geography of the land and its conditions with the same methodical focus she had brought to the account books. Bernard was patient in teaching her and, more importantly, was not patient in the condescending way that involved not teaching her the real thing but rather a simplified version of it. He taught her what he actually knew with its full complexity and trusted her to keep up. She kept up. Two Rivers taught her about horses, or rather allowed her to watch and ask questions while he worked, which was, she had come to understand, Two Rivers' version of formal instruction and was not to be confused with being ignored. He spoke rarely but precisely, and everything he said was worth having. He had been in the territory his whole life, unlike most of the other people on the ranch, and his knowledge of the land and the water and the seasons was of an entirely different order than Bernard's, which was the knowledge of a man who had learned over 16 years, carefully and with intelligence. Two Rivers' knowledge had a different quality, rooted in a relationship with the land that went back further, and was connected to things that had been disrupted by the arrival of people like Bernard and Rosa in ways that were real, and that Rosa thought about with the honesty she tried to apply to difficult things. She and Two Rivers talked about this once directly, after she had asked him something about the Jicarilla Apache territory and what the creation of the reservation system had meant. He looked at her for a long moment with the assessment in his eyes that he applied to things he was deciding whether to trust. "You ask because you want to know," he said, "not because you want me to tell you it is acceptable." "Yes," Rosa said. He told her then some of it, the displacement and the reduction and the particular indignity of being made small in the place where your people had been large, the way the reservation system had drawn lines around lives that had not previously been lived inside lines, and the way that official promises had a consistent history of meaning less than the words they were made with. Rosa did not try to make it better with words. She listened, and she thought, and she said at the end, "I am grateful you told me. I think it is important to know the true shape of things, even when the true shape is not comfortable." Two Rivers nodded once, which was his version of significant acknowledgement. She told Bernard about the conversation that evening, and they talked about it seriously, about the injustices that had been done, and about what it meant to be building a life in the territory in the year 1883, and what responsibilities came with that. Bernard was not a man who dealt in easy absolution for either himself or others, and he did not try to minimize what Two Rivers had said. He sat with the weight of it, the way he sat with most serious things, and then he said that he had tried, at least, to manage his own land and his own water with the understanding that the territory was not simply a resource to be taken but a place to be part of, and that he hoped that counted for something, even if it did not undo the larger wrong. They did not resolve the conversation because there was nothing to resolve. Some things are what they are, and honesty requires acknowledging that. In June, Rosa understood, with the particular certainty of a woman who knows her own body, that she was expecting a child. She told Bernard on a June evening when the light through the kitchen window was long and gold, and the smell of summer grass came in on the warm air. He looked at her with an expression that went very still, and then broke open into something she had never seen on his face before, a complete unguarded joy that made him look briefly younger and entirely defenseless. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly rough. "Are you well?" he said, which was not the first thing she had expected him to say, but which was, on reflection, entirely characteristic of him to go immediately to the practical concern for her. "I am very well," she said. "I feel perfectly fine." "Good," he said. He held her hands. Good. Esperanza was told the following morning, and responded by immediately reorganizing her kitchen priorities in ways that appeared to involve a significant increase in the variety and volume of food she was preparing, which was her consistent language for deep affection. She also had opinions about Rosa's schedule, about how much riding was appropriate, about the proper management of a pregnancy in high desert country versus the habits of women in cities who did not know what they were doing. And she delivered these opinions as she delivered most things, with the directness of a woman who had been right about too many things to be modest about it. Rosa navigated Esperanza's convictions with a combination of genuine affection and firm practicality, accepting the dietary augmentations gratefully and continuing to ride out with Bernard through the summer at a reduced schedule that was, in fact, Rosa's own good judgment rather than Esperanza's prescription, though she did not make a point of saying so. The summer of 1883 was a good one on the Donnelly ranch. The rains came at the right time. The cattle prices held steady. The new section of fence that Calhoun and Hayes had rebuilt after the spring floods held perfectly. 2 Rivers found and purchased 3 new horses in July from a dealer he trusted, animals of such clear quality that Bernard was visibly moved by them in the quiet way he was moved by excellent animals, which was one of the things about him Rosa found consistently endearing. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the warm summer dark and talked about everything and nothing, about the accounts and the cattle and the territory politics and the books they were both reading, and sometimes they were quiet together, and the quiet was full rather than empty. She also, in that summer, made the kind of small private peace with her father's memory that cannot be forced and cannot be hurried and arrives, when it does arrive, with the simplicity of something that was always there waiting. She thought about him not as the absence that had shaped her childhood, and not as the imperfect man who had failed both her and her mother, but as a complete and limited human being who had done some things wrong and some things right, who had loved a ranch and horses and the territory's particular sky, who had kept her mother's letters until he died. She thought about the letter he had written in 1871 that had sent her mother into the boarding house years and eventually sent Rosa herself west on a stagecoach to find him. She thought about the box of papers Bernard had kept for 5 years. She thought, there are different ways to be a father. Thomas Grayson had been one kind, the kind that was primarily an absence and a name carried in someone else's chest. Bernard Donnelly, who would be the father of her child in the autumn, would be a different kind. She was sure of this with the clarity she had learned to trust. Bernard had built new bookshelves in the sitting room over the summer, partly because the existing shelf was overflowing, and partly, Rosa suspected, because he had noticed that she had begun, tentatively and with the slightly worried expression of someone spending money on something optional, to acquire books from the catalog that came by mail. He built the shelves on a Saturday afternoon and did not mention why he had built them, but when she ran her hand along the smooth-planed wood and looked at him, he met her eyes with an expression that said everything without saying anything. She kissed him in front of the new empty shelves, and he put his arm around her in the particular way he had, which was not a tentative gesture but a whole-hearted one, the arm of a man who knew where he wanted to be. The baby came in early November, on a cold morning with the season's first hard frost on the grass, and the cottonwoods bare against the pale sky. And he was a boy, solid and loud, and possessed from the very first moments of an opinion about his circumstances that he intended to make known to everyone present. Bernard, who had been in the house and in the kitchen, and in and out of every room that was not the bedroom with the barely suppressed urgency of a man trying to be practical and utterly failing at it, came through the door when Esperanza finally allowed him, and stood at the bedside, and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has encountered something beyond the reach of his usual emotional vocabulary. "He is tremendous," Bernard said, which Rosa found so perfectly, absurdly accurate that she laughed, even exhausted and wrung out as she was. "He is very loud," Rosa said. "Yes," Bernard said. He was still looking at the baby with that expression. "That seems right." They named him Thomas, after Rosa's father, because it seemed right and because Bernard suggested it, which was one of the things she had loved him for. That suggestion, made quietly and without any show, as if naming the boy for a complicated man who had not been able to be what his daughter needed was simply the natural and honest thing to do. Thomas Donnelly came into the world in the first days of November 1883 and settled into the ranch house with the immediate authority of someone who had decided this was his place. Esperanza was devoted to him in a way that was both overwhelming and wonderful. The hands came to the house one by one that first week and looked at him with the slightly baffled tenderness that large, practical men tend to bring to very small new people. Calhoun said he was a fine boy with the tone of a verdict he had thought over carefully. Hayes said he was the most amazing thing he had ever seen, which was sincere if not perhaps geographically accurate. Two Rivers looked at him for a long, quiet moment and said, in the tone of a man making an observation of fact, that he would be tall. Rosa thought this was probably right. Winter came again, and with it the rhythms that had become, in the year since she had first ridden up the creek road on a hired bay mare, entirely and completely her own. The cold mornings and the warm kitchen and the account books and the afternoon rides along the creek and the evenings on the porch and the sitting room and the particular quality of the territory stars. The sound of Thomas in the next room, demanding and confident as he was in all things. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and good food and horses, which was the essential smell of the ranch, and which she had come to love as the smell of home. She thought about her mother sometimes in these winter evenings and wished she could see this. She thought her mother would have approved of Bernard, and that the approval would have been precise and honest rather than easy and unconditional, because that was the kind of person her mother had been, and she missed that precision. She thought her mother would have been fiercely, unsentimentally happy for her, and that this was the best kind of happiness to wish for someone. She thought occasionally about the journey, the rattling stagecoach and the endless territory dust, and the flat, careful voice asking questions in 100 general stores. She thought about the moment on the first morning, standing in Bernard Donnelly's yard with a question she had carried for 26 years, watching him come toward her across the corral. She thought about the way his face had moved when she said her father's name, that brief, complex movement that had told her, before he said a word, that the name was known. She had come to the territory looking for her father. She had found a rancher who said he knew that name and went quiet. And in the going quiet, in that brief, weighted silence beside the corral fence in the October morning, the whole future had pivoted on its hinge. By the spring of 1885, the Donnelly Ranch had expanded by a modest but significant parcel of land to the northeast, water rights included, negotiated through the same patient legal process Bernard had applied to the original property. The account books were in better shape than they had been in 16 years of the ranch's existence, and the correspondence with the cattle buyers in Santa Fe and Albuquerque had been regularized into something professional and reliable. Thomas, who was a year and a half and in a phase of intense personal locomotion and loud commentary on his findings, had discovered the barn and was regarded with cautious affection by the horses and with resigned devotion by everyone who worked there. Two Rivers had accepted, over the 2 years since Rosa had come to the ranch, a kind of acknowledged authority over the horse management that was more formal than it had previously been, with a corresponding adjustment in his compensation that Bernard and Rosa had agreed was both right and, practically speaking, good business. Two Rivers said nothing about this when it was offered, which was his version of thank you, and the quality of the ranch's horses over the following years made the decision self-evidently correct. Calhoun retired in the autumn of 1885 to a small house in Cutter's Creek that he bought with his savings, and came out to the ranch for meals occasionally with the ease of a man who had left a place without leaving it entirely. Hayes had become, by this point, a competent and reliable hand, with the makings of someone who could run a smaller operation of his own one day, which Bernard told him directly, because he believed in telling people true things about their capacities. In the winter of 1885, Rosa discovered she was expecting a second child, and this time the particular quiet joy of it was different, not less but different, the joy of something known rather than something entirely new. She was 31 and healthy, and had the advantage of knowing this time, in a way she had not entirely known the first time, that she was capable of it. Bernard received the news with the same careful, full-hearted response he had brought to the first telling, which was one of the many things about him she relied on, that he did not diminish repetition, that each important thing retained its importance in his hands. The second child was a girl, born in the July of 1886 on a hot summer morning when the territory was in the full ferocity of its summer, and the cottonwoods along the creek were heavy and dark green with leaf. They named her Catherine, for Rosa's mother, which was Rosa's idea and Bernard's immediate and unqualified agreement. Catherine Donnelly came into the world as an entirely different proposition from her brother, quieter in her assessments and more precise in her demands, with a pair of dark eyes that looked at everything around her from the first weeks with an expression of patient evaluation that made Esperanza say, in the tone she used for things she considered settled fact, that this one was going to know everything. Thomas, who was 2 3/4 and had well-established opinions about his position in the household, regarded his sister with a complex expression that moved between imperious suspicion and reluctant fascination, and eventually, over the following months, settled into the businesslike protectiveness of someone who has decided that a new arrival is his particular responsibility. The ranch in the summer of 1886 was full of children and sound and work, and the easy daily intimacy of people who have made a life together with intention and care. Rosa rode out with Bernard in the cooler mornings, Catherine strapped to her in the manner Esperanza had taught her, Thomas on his own small horse beside them. Because Bernard had put Thomas on horseback at 2 1/2 and there had been no question that the boy was at home there. They rode along the creek road in the early summer light, the water bright and fast with the last of the spring snowmelt, the grass intensely green on both banks, the cottonwoods casting long morning shadows across the trail. Rosa sometimes thought about the first time she had ridden this road, 8 miles northeast from Cutter's Creek on a hired bay mare in October of 1882, following someone else's directions to a stranger's ranch, carrying a question that had taken 26 years to become urgent enough to bring her here. She thought about how thin and provisional the thread of it had been, how easily it might not have led here, and she did not dwell in that possibility because it was not useful, but she held the counterfactual briefly and let it go, which was enough to sharpen the present into something she could not take for granted. Bernard, riding beside her in the morning, looked at her in the sideways way he sometimes did, reading something in her face that she had not exactly put there for public consumption. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The first time I rode this road," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember watching you ride up," he said. "You had the look of someone who was prepared for disappointment but was not going to let it stop her." "I had been disappointed a fair number of times by that point," Rosa said. "Yes," he said, "but you kept coming." They rode on through the morning, the horses moving at the easy traveling walk that covers ground without urgency, the territory laid out around them in all its extravagant, demanding beauty. Thomas was narrating something to his horse in the confidential tone he used for his most important communications. Catherine was asleep against Rosa's chest with the completeness of a very young child who has decided that this is a reasonable place to be and sees no reason to second-guess it. The creek ran alongside them, bright and cold and unconcerned with anything except its own direction. In the following years, the ranch grew and the family grew, and the territory itself changed around them in the ways that territories change as they move toward statehood. The surveying and the lawmaking and the slow accumulation of civic structures that turn open land into a governed place. Rosa kept the accounts through all of it and watched the financial landscape of the territory's ranching industry with the attentive intelligence she brought to everything she studied. And she understood before most of their neighbors understood that the open range era was ending, and that the ranchers who would survive the change were the ones who consolidated their water rights, managed their land carefully, and built relationships with the buyers in the growing cities rather than depending on the old informal networks. She told Bernard what she saw, directly and without softening, as she had always done, and he listened and thought and acted, as he had always done. And the Donnelly Ranch navigated the last years of the 1880s better than most operations its size. Thomas turned 5 in November of 1888 and immediately communicated that he was old enough for more responsibility, a proposition that Bernard took entirely seriously and responded to with the assignment of specific, genuine tasks. The boy was, it became clear, primarily his father in disposition, methodical and patient and deeply attached to the practical world, though he had Rosa's precision with numbers, a combination that suggested he was going to be good at exactly the kind of work the ranch required. Catherine turned 3 in July of 1889 and began, around this time, to demonstrate the scope of what Esperanza had predicted about her knowing everything, in that she was in a phase of comprehensive, systematic inquiry that covered every subject accessible to a 3-year-old in a working ranch household, and many that were technically beyond that range. She asked Bernard once, with the focused directness of someone who wants a real answer and will know if she is not getting one, why the water in the creek went that direction and not the other, and Bernard told her, fully and seriously, about the lay of the land and the direction of flow, and she listened to the whole thing with the expression of someone filing information, and then asked 4 more questions that demonstrated she had understood everything he had said and wanted the next layer underneath it. Rosa, watching this from the kitchen doorway with her coffee, felt something so large and warm in her chest that it was almost difficult to hold. She thought about Kansas City. She thought about the boarding house room and her mother's tired face, and the oil lamp guttering low and the yellow letter pressed into her palm. She thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the flat, careful voice asking questions. She thought about a gray October morning and a rancher coming across a corral toward her, and the moment he heard her father's name and went quiet, and how in that silence, without either of them knowing it yet, everything had begun. In the spring of 1890, Rosa discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She was 36 years old and Bernard was 42, and they had been on this ranch together for 8 years, and it had been, she would have said to anyone who asked, and said it without any of the hedging that people sometimes use to manage the expectation of envy, the best 8 years of her life. Not because they had been easy, because they had not been easy, the territory did not do easy, but because they had been full of work and beauty and the kind of daily love that is not dramatic but is instead woven into every ordinary moment of every ordinary day. The 3rd child was a boy, born in the November of 1890, who they named James, after Bernard's father. He was a serene baby, undemanding in a way that seemed, after Thomas and Catherine, almost implausibly restful, and Esperanza said he was an old soul, meaning it as a compliment of the highest order. He grew into a boy who was gentle with animals in a way that reminded Rosa, when she thought about it honestly, of what Bernard had told her about Thomas Grayson, about the way her father had loved horses, and she thought, perhaps some things move through blood in ways we do not choose and do not understand, and perhaps that is not something to be sorry about, but simply something to see clearly. Bernard's mother came from Ohio in the summer of 1891, making the journey west at 73 with the determination of a woman who had been waiting long enough to see her son's family, and had decided that if the family was not coming to her, she would go to them. She was a small, sharp woman with a strong Irish accent that had survived 40 years in Ohio without significant dilution, and she looked at the ranch and at Rosa, and at the three children with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who has been thinking about this moment for a long time. She took Rosa's hands in both of hers on the first evening and held them and said, "You are exactly right." She said it simply as a statement of observable fact, and Rosa, who had not been expecting this, found her throat suddenly tight and could not immediately respond. "Thank you," she managed. "He wrote about you," Bernard's mother said, still holding her hands. "For years he wrote about you. I am glad he found his sense." Bernard, from across the room, had the expression of a man who would like to be somewhere else but is entirely committed to remaining where he is. "Thank you, Mother," he said, with great dignity. His mother looked at him with the look of a woman who has been reading this particular face for 42 years. "You chose well," she said. "That is all I am saying." Rosa spent the summer of 1891 with Bernard's mother, Margaret, who was there for 3 months, and she found her to be one of the most interesting people she had ever met. Margaret had come to America at 20 from County Clare, had married Bernard's father at 22, and spent 40 years in Ohio building a life and raising children and managing a household with the competence of someone who had never had the option of incompetence. She had opinions about everything and was not sparing in sharing them, but her opinions were the kind that came from paying attention to the world, rather than the kind that come from needing the world to validate something already decided, and Rosa found them worth having. They talked often, in the evenings after supper when the children were in bed and Bernard was doing the last of the day's outdoor work, and Margaret asked about Kansas City and Rosa's mother and the journey west, and listened to the whole of it with the complete attention of someone for whom the story of a woman making her way alone in difficult circumstances is not a small thing. "Your mother raised you right," Margaret said one evening, "to have that kind of courage. She was the brave one," Rosa said. "She stayed and managed and never complained. I only went west because she finally gave me permission to when she was dying." "That is its own kind of brave," Margaret said. When Bernard's mother left in September, she embraced Rosa and then held her by the shoulders and looked at her and said, "You are the best thing that has happened to this family in my lifetime. I include the ranch." And then she let go and said briskly to Bernard that his fence on the east side wanted looking at. She had seen it from the wagon, and he was to write to her in October. Bernard looked at his mother's departing wagon for a moment and then looked at Rosa. "The fence on the east side is perfectly adequate," he said. "I know," Rosa said, "but she has to find something." He laughed, which was a sound she never took for granted, because Bernard's genuine laughter was rare enough to remain valuable. He put his arm around her and they watched the wagon until it turned onto the creek road and disappeared behind the cottonwoods. The territory became New Mexico Territory officially by the Congress's designations and the slow work of formal incorporation into the American governmental structure continued through the early 1890s, bringing with it more settlers and more surveying and more legal complexity. And Rosa followed all of it with the careful intelligence she applied to everything that affected the ranch's future. She kept meticulous files of every legal document pertaining to the Donnelly land and water rights, because she had seen enough of what happened to ranches whose paperwork was careless, and she was not going to let that happen here. Thomas, at 9 and 10 and 11, was becoming seriously useful on the ranch, which Bernard handled with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, making sure the boy was learning skill and judgment rather than simply performing labor. Catherine, brilliant and perpetually curious, was being educated at home by Rosa and by a schoolteacher in Cutter's Creek who came out to the ranch twice a week, and was already reading at a level that surprised everyone except Rosa, who had expected it. James was a solid, happy boy who followed 2 rivers around the ranch with open worship, and was being given, without formal announcement, a comprehensive education in the horses and the land. In the autumn of 1894, Rosa sat at the desk in the small office off the kitchen, the same desk she had sat at 12 years ago when Bernard had offered her work, and she had said she would think about it, and she looked at the account books. They were in excellent order. They had been in excellent order for years. Outside the window, in the clear October afternoon, she could hear Thomas and one of the newer hands working on something near the barn, and Catherine's voice from inside the house, reading something aloud to James in the sitting room, and from further away the sound of horses in the north corral. Bernard appeared in the office doorway. He had been out since morning checking the fall cattle, and he had the look of a man who had spent a good day outdoors doing useful work, the settled, weather-worn contentment of it. He leaned in the doorway and looked at her. "Accounts good," he said. "Very good," she said. "The fall sales were strong. We are in better shape than we have been in the fall for several years." "Good," he said. He came into the office and stood beside the desk and looked at the ledgers with the expression of a man who is grateful that someone else understands them, which was exactly what she had always known he felt about it. "Bernard," she said. He looked at her. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say, and she found, now that she was going to say it, that it was simple. "I want to tell you that I am very glad I rode up this road that October morning." He looked at her in the way he had when she said something he needed a moment to hold. Then he reached down and took her hand from where it rested on the desk and held it. "So am I," he said, "more than I have ever been glad of anything." She stood up from the desk, and he put his arms around her in the kitchen warm afternoon, with the sound of their children in the house and the territory sky outside the window going gold and amber in the October light, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, breathing in the smell of horses and outdoor air and the particular irreplaceable substance of him. And she thought, this is what it is. This is the shape of it. This ordinary, extraordinary afternoon, this home. Thomas knocked on the office door at that moment and pushed it open without waiting for an answer. At 11, the uncomplicated directness of a boy who has never had to wonder whether he is welcome, and said there was something wrong with the water in the south trough, and could his father come look. Bernard released Rosa and looked at his son with the expression he kept specifically for Thomas in the moments when he was most recognizably himself in the boy. 5 minutes, he said. Thomas disappeared. Bernard looked back at Rosa. "The ranch," he said, with a slight gesture that took in the office and the house and the corrals and the creek road and all of it. "The ranch," Rosa said, in full agreement. He went to find out what was wrong with the south trough, and Rosa sat back down at the desk, and the afternoon continued in all its full and ordinary abundance. Outside the window, the October light moved slowly across the grass, and the cottonwood leaves came down one by one, and the creek ran along its banks, cold and clear. The same creek it had been when she first rode beside it 12 years ago, and the same creek it would be when Thomas rode beside it in his own right, and when Catherine took her brilliant, inquiring mind to whatever large corner of the world she chose to direct it at, and when James grew to the height 2 rivers had predicted in the first week of his life, and brought his gentle knowledge of horses to everything he touched. 12 years since she had come to the territory with a carpetbag and a name. 12 years since she had stood in Bernard Donnelly's yard with a question she had been carrying since childhood, and watched him hear her father's name and go quiet with the weight of what he knew and what it was going to cost him to say. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger and began to enter the fall figures in her clear, careful hand, and the fire in the stove behind her was warm, and the voices of her children came through the walls of the house that was her home, and the territory in October was as beautiful as anything she had ever seen or expected to see, and she was 39 years old and exactly where she was meant to be. The accounts balanced, as they always did, to the last cent. Outside, Bernard's voice carried across the yard to Thomas, clear and steady in the fall air, teaching the boy something true about the land and the water and the way things work when you pay attention to them. And Rosa listened to the sound of it and smiled at the ledger page and kept writing. The scratching of the pen on paper, the small, quiet sound of a life being kept well. The cottonwood leaves came down gold on the October grass, and the creek ran on, and the territory sky was enormous and blazing and entirely indifferent to human happiness, which was perhaps why human happiness, when it was genuinely arrived at and genuinely held, felt in this place like something earned and real, and not to be taken lightly for even a single ordinary, extraordinary day.